This is a reading of the commentary on the 10th applied precept. It's the last of the series of the 10 applied precepts, so it completes this cycle of the introduction and the 10 individual precept commentaries. Caring. The 10th applied precept. I bear witness to my own lack of faith in the power of living in accordance with the reality of life as it is, and aspire to live each moment with mindfulness and caring. Traditionally, the 10th grave precept, not defaming the three treasures. Bodhidharma said, self-nature is subtle and mysterious. In the realm of the One, not holding dualistic concepts of ordinary beings and sages is called the precept of not defaming the three treasures. Dogen Zenji said, the teisho of the actual body is the harbour and the weir. This is the most important thing in the world. Its virtue finds its home in the ocean of essential nature. It is beyond explanation. We just accept it with respect and gratitude. The three treasures, also called the three jewels, are Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. While often in Buddhism you find an emphasis on how different, how exceptional the Buddha is, Bodhidharma here says we actually defame, we insult, misrepresent, betray the three treasures exactly by thinking they're in any way something different from all of us ordinary beings and the ordinary lives we lead. Not separate. There's a modern Zen koan. Actually, it's from Barry again, although he says, I only meant it as a joke, but it asks, what's the difference between a Zen student and a realized Zen master? The answer is, the student thinks there's a difference. It's a question of coming to realize that we are not separate from each other or from some outside world, but also of realizing this in such a way that it doesn't betray or elide our very real differences from one another and also within ourselves. Not simple. But this is what all these commentaries on the different precepts have been pointing to in their different ways. So the place to begin, the place to enter, is always right here, right now, with my experiencing in this moment. So, I live in and as my own lack of faith and my own aspiration, just as they are in this moment. This wider awareness is more than our simple moment-to-moment awareness of the passing world, and it is the kind of mindfulness of something like holding in mind, keeping in mind, to which this precept points. The temptation is always to put even our non-judgmental awareness to work in the pursuit of a future, a getting better, of fixing me up. So, instead, I hold my lack of faith and my aspiration. I hold them together, not separate. The defaming in this precept is the same as the killing in the first precept, the basic act of separation. Now, okay, this is a subtle thought. I live within killing, and I bear witness to it each and every day. This is my practice. So by becoming aware of separation at one level, I recognize my wholeness at another. I live within my lack of faith in the power of living in accordance with the reality of life as it is. I bear witness to this in each moment. By being aware and being honest about this, I hold together at one level what is separate at another level. In their different ways, and perhaps seemingly paradoxically, the precepts all point to the absence of a beyond, a goal, an elsewhere or an elsewhen. We enter here. We enter now. Dogen Zenji, in his commentary on this precept, said, the teisho of the actual body is the harbour and the weir. This is the most important thing in the world. Its virtue finds its home in the ocean of essential nature. It is beyond explanation. We just accept it with respect and gratitude. The teisho of the body is hearing the body, my body, this body, hearing it teaching. A teisho is a demonstration rather than a lecture, more like a chemistry demo where you actually get to see the liquid change colour or see the powder catch fire, the precipitate coming out of solution. More like that than it is a history lecture. In this teisho, Dogen points to the way you experience the response within yourself. So the teisho of the body is this body showing the way through my awareness of my experience of this very moment, right here, right now. It's the pain in my shoulder, the queasy feeling in the pit of my stomach, the electricity of my skin in the presence of my beloved. It is beyond explanation. We accept it with respect and gratitude. This is exactly Dogen's identity of practice and realization. The teisho of the body is always right here, right now. Wisdom and compassion, all care and understanding. The practice principles say, being just this moment, compassion's way. So just what is meant by compassion? Within Buddhism as a whole, karuna and prajna, normally translated as compassion and wisdom, have been seen as the two complementary sides of awakening. We've already asked whether compassion is a good translation of karuna. Isn't compassion just too much about me, about my feelings, and about my treating someone else as compassion's object? Isn't it just too separate? So why choose this term in the first place? Within our Judeo-Christian tradition, compassion is seen as a noble virtue to be distinguished from the vulgar feeling of attachment to other people, being bound to them, involved, even desiring or needing them, objective, detached, autonomous, and hence not showing our own shared vulnerability. Similarly, metta was translated as loving kindness rather than love. Too vulgar, too embodied, too corporeal, with its echoes of the controversy over the meaning of the love practiced by the early Christians as agape. Compassion derives from Latin, the language of culture, of civilization, of education, of Western spirituality itself. But there is in existence an English word that covers all the ground we need to, all the way from feeling and thinking about to direct and sustained action in relationship. That word is care. Less cultivated, certainly. Caring has by and large been women's work, and very often the work of poorer and less educated women at that. These carers care because they have to, because nobody else is willing to, because they're emotionally attached, because they need the money. This is not the noble and disinterested compassion of the saint or the philosopher. We might, of course, ask, who is it who cared for our saints and philosophers? Who brought them? Who brought him, because overwhelmingly him, his food, did his washing or cleaned his room while he was occupied experiencing such deep compassion for others? So for wisdom's companion, it's perhaps no surprise that the early translators chose compassion over care. But it's also a huge shame. Care reaches wide to embrace the full scope of our real lives and its resonances and infinite shades of meaning. Care may be a burden one feels or carries. Responsibility, it may be suffering. It may be an attraction, a love that's familial, or that of friendship. Romance, desire. It may be the material or emotional help one offers or accepts, that one gives or receives, and often is some admixture of all of these. Care may well be one's work, might be my profession, vocation, career, or simply paying the rent. Care relieves us of the delusion of the higher plane on which karuna may be imagined to operate. Caring is relationship. It is involved, concrete, whether that's a matter of deep emotion or forced economic necessity. Caring places us in the real world of the relative, the contingent of our life as it is. Caring is relationship. Thich Nhat Hanh stressed that compassion is understanding what is appropriate action in the situation in front of me. So not just a kind of warm feeling about things, but rather about how we act in the world, which brings us back directly to care. Is this understanding some kind of utilitarian mental calculus of possible outcomes? Nhat Hanh himself uses a very direct embodied image of what he instead actually means. He uses the image of the relationship between my two hands. They naturally act as one while also remaining distinct from each other. The right hand must act as right hand, the left as left, in order to work together. This is actually a pretty perfect image of caring rather than compassion. Each hand responds to the other in what is needed in that moment. We just do what needs doing. There's no big deal. No helper, nobody helped, just empty action. Our hands don't wonder what to do, don't think well or badly of themselves, don't fall out with each other or want some kind of a reward. Nhat Hanh tells the story of hammering in a nail. I paraphrase it. When the hammer I am holding in my right hand slips and hits my thumb, holding the nail to the wall, does my right hand say, "It wasn't my fault. You are so clumsy to get in the way like that"? Does my left hand say, "Give me the hammer. I want revenge"? No, my right hand just moves swiftly to hold and help my aching left. So, hence, when we find ourselves in a situation that needs an immediate response, we don't see ourselves as separate, as outside the situation, and so we act accordingly as part of the situation. Understanding caring has to begin in the non-separation of myself and all things. I don't imagine I can stand outside, but see that I'm already together with the suffering, a part of the situation as it is. Not lofty contemplation, but staunching the flow of blood, wiping up the mess, fixing dinner. We might also ask whether a shift from compassion to care changes how we might think of the relationship between karuna and prajna. Thich Nhat Hanh actually suggests that prajna is better translated as understanding rather than wisdom, more immediately and more practically oriented. So if prajna is the understanding of how to care appropriately in each moment, we might even reverse the implied priority here. Not wisdom somehow leading to compassion, but care that requires our understanding of appropriate action in each moment. Care and understanding certainly sound less glamorous and exalted than wisdom and compassion, but perhaps also more realistic, more usable, and perhaps that's the point. Care and understanding, the understanding of how to care effectively in any particular situation, given the non-separation, the boundlessness, the emptiness, shunyata, of all things. So the question becomes, how does my wholeness manifest as caring in this moment? How does my care for all beings, remembering the four great vows, show up as care for these beings in this moment? With real insight, Thich Nhat Hanh's story of hands working together provides us with an image of care that includes the potential for misunderstanding, the getting it wrong, the rupture and repair that are an essential part of the deepening and growing of relationship in our real lives and our real caring. Maybe read the story again. This is a vital point, vital too to recognise that just as some relationships are very damaging in the suffering that's a part of them, and that all have their stresses and their failures, so much caring can be exploitative or unfair, and all will have its elements of suffering. To think in terms of care is not to promise some panacea, but to invite us to examine the reality of our own lives and those of other people, of our own society and of the world as a whole. It's to ask us about the limits of our own and collective understanding and how our priorities live out as the joys and suffering of which we're all a part. Canon Bosatsu. The precepts we study and vow to hold in our awareness, in our minds and hearts, are called the Bodhisattva precepts. Bodhisattva is Bosatsu in Sino-Japanese. These are the precepts that frame the Bodhisattva path of those working for the awakening, the saving, the freeing of all beings. I think it's a shame that there is perhaps something of terror in the response of most of us when presented with talk of the Bodhisattva path or the Bodhisattva ideal. A terror that I think is fostered by both the language of the sutras themselves and also the attitude of some teachers. It's true that this is a path to be treated with the utmost seriousness, but, and here's the rub, it's the path we're every one of us already on, whether we choose to recognise it or not. And in one sense, it's the recognition of this fact that is the most vital step. But the way the Bodhisattva path is talked about can make it sound more like a Navy SEAL or an SAS operation. Suffering reported, 3 kalpas ahead, sir. I'm going in, Sergeant. Cover me. I may not make it out of there this side of rebirth. On your 6, sir. But the reality of most Bodhisattva action is utterly mundane, and is, thereby, exactly also the great matter of life and death. Our chanting of the 4 great vows is an affirmation of the diagnosis and treatment of the human condition that Shakyamuni Buddha offered us what we now know as the 4 Noble Truths, the reality and universality of the experience of dukkha. While it's usually translated as suffering, dukkha is actually much wider than this: discomfort, unsatisfactoriness, dis-ease. Its root comes from the frictional rubbing of a badly fitting wooden axle into its bearing. It's all in life that is not smooth running, not as we would wish it to be. This is precisely the gap between life as it is and life as I imagine I'd want it to be, that Joko calls us back to recognise as the very heart of ordinary mind practice. The Buddha put it both boldly and bluntly. Birth is dukkha. Aging is dukkha. Sickness is dukkha. Death is dukkha. Encountering what is not dear is dukkha. Separation from what is dear is dukkha. Not getting what one wants is dukkha. The Buddha does not say I suffer, or you suffer, or even we all suffer, but there is suffering. It's only when we begin to both understand and experience ourselves as not separate that the relative difference between self and other loses much of its problematic, as we come to understand this difference less dualistically. In terms of our bodhisattva vow to free or save all beings, it's not up to me to save everyone or anyone. It's not that anyone else is more or less deserving than I am. Our path is simply to address this suffering, whether it's experienced as me, or as you, or as them. As we are not separate, we can only ever really address our suffering collectively, and in fact we can only do that through caring relationship. In different ways, caring is the activity of all the bodhisattvas, but preeminently of Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of great caring. There's a traditional image of Avalokiteshvara as having 1,000 arms, the better to care for the world. We might point out in our Zen tradition that the classic statement of our everyday practice as chop wood, carry water, can also be stated as clean up diarrhea, change bed sheets, ring dentist. To see all caring as bodhisattva action is to inject a concrete and very necessary dose of reality into whatever fantasies we have about both bodhisattvas and the purpose of our own practice. We might too be more inclined to offer a little more respect to the myriad carers on whom we rely, and respect more to our own caring activity which our society regards as secondary at best. We might want to ask some searching questions of this society. The Bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, has 1,000 arms, but we need many more. Fortunately, to count only the humans on this planet, we currently have around 16.4 billion arms, give or take, to care for ourselves, for each other, and for this world. The question of how we together organise ourselves in our caring is the most urgent we face. Another name for this question is politics. An ethics of care. We all, implicitly at least, begin our study of the precepts by asking, just tell me what I can do and what not to do. Even at this purely personal level, ethics already seems quite complex enough. As we come better to experience ourselves in and as relationship, as non-separation, this question changes to ask, how might we relate to each other, not simply face to face, but also collectively, globally? We've seen how living in a world organised as if we are all only separate individuals in permanent competition with each other gives rise to extraordinary inequality and violence, and with it the dissociation, denial and shaming we all experience in the effort to make sense of the deep contradictions that this way of seeing and acting in the world brings out. We've seen some of the different ways in which the threat and reality of coercion and violence are at the heart of this world order, and the sense in which to be a citizen, to be a subject in such a society is already to have internalised this as self-coercion and as fear of the other. This point cannot be overstated. For us, power is underpinned, is guaranteed by violence as its final arbiter. The very image of power is the ability to call forth violence on those who oppose you. As sociologist Max Weber famously defined it, the state is a human community that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within a specific territory, which I might rephrase as a community whose dominant interests are able to enforce within a specific territory the exclusive right to what they are able to define as legitimate force. So, unconsciously and however unwillingly, we come to respect and admire this power of violence. And if we think of resistance to this threat of violence, a counterpower, it will reflexively take on the form of a counter-violence, whether that's to say as Star Wars shows it to us, or in the glamorizing of gangsters, or the lone hero with a gun. All of those, of course, are just stories, but the effects of our valorization of power as violence are very real world. If we want to understand, for instance, male violence against women, we have to begin with the fact that to be a man is to compete for power, a power finally guaranteed by violence. Both the frustration and gratification of the feeling of power equally require the attempt to display that power through action on those defined as weaker. If I come to experience myself as omnipotent, as a politician, as a celebrity, as a success, then my sexual or other violence may simply be an expression of this. If I experience the shame of feeling myself a failure as a man, then to maintain any coherent sense of self, I may reflexively, perhaps even semi or unconsciously, react by asserting that self through violence and sexual violence as its most manly form. Even if we're thinking of resisting injustice, of the righting of wrongs, our first thought is always of justice as punishment or compensation, a justice enforced by the threat or reality of compulsion, of a violence that's at the actual root of our system of law itself. Law, a system of permissions and exclusions sanctioned by judgment and dependent on coercion and violence. This justice must always justify its own existence by appeals to God, to human nature, or simply to its own internal consistency, and frames itself in definitive rules in a system that aspires to universality. On this basis, justice tries to determine between the, by definition, antagonistic interests of what are imagined as entirely separate individuals and groups, with its judgments underpinned by the threat or reality of sanction and violent punishment. In the institution of law, the state creates its own absolute right to inflict whatever violence it chooses on us, and so long as we stay within its reach, each of us must live within this law. So thoroughgoing is our acceptance of this that it even extends to how we think of ethics itself. Just tell me what I'm allowed to do. What is allowed and what isn't? What sanctions will follow if I transgress? None of Buddhism is often any different. Will I be subject to endless rebirth or even descent into the hell realms? As citizens of our collective and individual moral maturity has even come to be seen as measured by our ability to reason from abstract and general principles in exactly this way. What should we be allowed and what forbidden? What price must we pay? In 1982, Carol Gilligan published In a Different Voice, a book that has come to be seen as beginning the contemporary discussion of the ethics of care. Over the last 40 years, this has evolved into a truly interdisciplinary field of research, reaching out into philosophy, psychology, sociology, anthropology, ecology, and economics, and has been explored within diverse strands of political and perhaps above all feminist thought. The different voice is that of an ethics built out of the lived experience of relationship, rather than from abstract principles, from caring rather than judging, from the particular rather than the universal, from engagement rather than objectivity, from an open response rather than a dualistic decision as to right and wrong. Beginning from her own psychological research into the nature of the supposed differences between girls and boys and the level of their moral development, Gilligan established that the very criteria by which girls were judged to be less morally developed than boys of a similar age, that in reality these presented an alternative sense of the ethical, one founded in the values of relationship and interdependence, rather than on rule-bound individualism. Joan Tronto is one philosopher we've already met in this context, and her work, Moral Boundaries from 1993, Caring Democracy from 2013, Who Cares from 2015, has helped bring much needed clarity to arguments which can easily become woolly and superficial, albeit well-meaning. It provides a clear articulation that the ethics of care are neither simply about the difference between men and women or looking after our loved ones, but about the relationship between our thinking around care and how caring does or does not happen in our societies. Why in practice is care so little regarded in terms of our image of power? Caring cannot but appear as weakness because we see and imagine power as the polar opposite of vulnerability. To exercise power in politics or business is held to require ruthlessness, and any trace of sentiment may betray us. For women, their assumed caring responsibilities, their perceived emotionality and lesser physical strength were long held to preclude their gaining or wielding power in the sense we imagine, and if this attitude is very slowly changing, our image of power itself seems firmly stuck. Further, for a culture in which the economic competition of all against all is seen to be self-evidently both desirable and inevitable as the basis of modern society, it's unsurprising that the values of care and relationship should seem of secondary importance. This only the more so when it's the very lack of recognition of the absolutely central place of all forms of care in our society, as reflected in so much of care work being low or unpaid, that enables the economy to function at all. It's the largely unaccounted for reproduction of the workforce that allows the productive work, making money, of the economy to take place. So many circles within circles, as women have been and in many respects still are assigned a lower place in social hierarchies, the work they do is that which is less valued, and they're less valued because that's the work they do. Care ethics requires us to take all this into account. Exactly who cares for whom, and how, why, and with what consequences. Detailed and empirical work. We're all both carers and cared for, but differently so, depending on our precise relationships within the play of power, of assumptions, of inequalities both within and beyond our own society. Such analysis invites us to question more deeply in ways directly relevant to our practice of Zen. What would a society look like that actually prioritised care as being the foundation of everything else we do? Can we begin even to imagine this? Not simply that all forms of care work, including housework, of course, are properly remunerated, but that we collectively change our values to come to see caring in its infinitely diverse forms as our primary activity, towards which end we realign other economic, social and political structures. Of course, as individual private citizens, this is in some ways already how we think. What matters most in the world to you? Well, my family does. Yeah, but the way in which our society draws the distinction between private and public makes our caring as individuals and families both impossible to scale up and hugely vulnerable to the pressures of the outside world. Hence, for generations of men, and still, caring for my family has meant being both the breadwinner and a dutiful citizen supporting the status quo and, if needs be, dying in foreign wars. While for a woman it's meant performing complex caring roles in a position of dependency within the family, and all for love, unpaid, while quite possibly also doing real, i.e. paid, work outside the home as well. More recently, ideas of gender equity and of the increasing demands made on families have led to a somewhat more equal sharing of roles, but within the context of an ever-increasing burden of productive work that now requires both parents in most families to hold full-time jobs and hence subcontract much of the caring for their children to outside paid agencies or to other unpaid family members. Nota bene. Professional childcare is an essential service. The problems come when its use is held to be obligatory because only the work that parents do outside the home is remunerated, and or such professional childcare is, in practice, unaffordable. A society that placed caring at its heart, rather than othering care to the fringes of the economy or beyond, would not regard its own people as primarily being a workforce to be trained and disciplined, cared for only according to their economic value to the powerful. Such a society would renegotiate the public-private divide, meaning that between what counts as work and what does not? What is our collective concern and what is not? Presumably the provision of human-centred housing rather than of construction, of food grown for human well-being rather than agri-industrial profit, of public rather than private transport, of public healthcare and wider measures for public health would be significant and higher priorities. Utopian? Well, perhaps, but why? Such a society would in reality be more rational than our current system and hugely increase the actual well-being of all. Even simply as a thought experiment to point out the madness of our current system, well, there's real value in imagining that things might be otherwise. That some human beings choose to put profit over people does not mean that we cannot collectively choose to do otherwise, to do better. And, as I've already insisted, right here and right now we do better. We care. We care about. We care for. We care with, and we are cared for. Every day. As individuals, as families, as communities, and for many of us in our jobs too, we can and we do care. With the move towards care ethics, we're not attempting to invent a perfect society from scratch, but working from what we already do, who we already are, what we already have, our connections, our attachments, our loves, our needs, and our vulnerability. An ethics beyond violence. By placing the process of relationship at its heart, care ethics challenges the image of power to which we've collectively fallen victim, and with it the place of domination and violence in our societies. It challenges too the internalised fear of judgment and punishment that enables it. Living within this fear, we bring it to bear on our individual and collective reactions to both the everyday problems of life and the genuine injustice we see around us. Care ethics questions whether our first thought of justice must always be of judgment and punishment rather than of caring and of process. We might remember the furore around the Black Lives Matter movement's call to defund the police, as if the aim had been to release a tide of violence across our towns and cities. The true purpose was very different from this, although you could be forgiven for entirely missing it in the cacophony of outraged hostility or bland "yes, but" responses. Is our go-to response to any social problem to think in terms of violent restraint, the law and the judicial system, or of addressing the underlying problem itself? What are the consequences of either approach? And implicitly, what should we collectively be resourcing or spending money on? Perhaps the example of public health might be useful. We've already noted that the huge reduction in mortality rates over the second half of the 19th and 20th centuries was not so much due to medical advances, but the result of basic collective public health measures. So, in the face of a cholera epidemic, do we ration, by our ability to pay, all the clean water that actually is available, and do we imprison those who become ill or object to our doing this? Or do we provide clean water for all as a public benefit to all, including the wealthy, and so prevent further epidemics and minimise all cases of waterborne diseases? Coercion or care? If the Zen precepts are inevitably a form of ethics, what do we see as the fundamental question this ethics asks of us? If the explicit aim of our precepts is to practice non-separation, non-violence, how can they be part of an ethics based on coercion? If it's in our experiencing of the fear of coercion and the othering that our sense of our very selves, our subjectivity comes to be experienced as being separate, as isolated, as our being uniquely responsible for ourselves and for our actions, then in this sense isn't the justice of judgment and punishment exactly the problem rather than the solution? At the very least, is it not in need of being dethroned from our unreflective acceptance of its sovereignty over us? Only the more so if we allow ourselves to come to see our own caring, our caring about, our caring with, our caring for, and our being cared for, as the base, the ground of our ethics. It then becomes self-evident that we all already do practice a very different kind of ethics alongside that of justice, but one that's rarely been recognised as such, precisely because in our societies caring has come to be seen as secondary, as unproductive, as unpleasant, as to do with physical and emotional labour rather than intellectual, and preeminently as the work inflicted on the powerless at the behest of the powerful. It is seen as the work of women, of migrants, the poor, of underachievers and feminised or emasculated men. Nevertheless, in reality is the infinite work of caring that continues to sustain our societies all day, every day. If we ask about what an ethics of care might look like, we come to see that an understanding of ethics very different from that of judgment is not only possible, but essential. We can come to hear ethics in a different voice. One that, however unfamiliar, is somehow also our own. Seen in terms of caring, our own individual ethical awareness develops through our actual lived relationships and actions in the world, and as such is often not speakable or able to be conceptualised in any simple way, and certainly not taking the form of abstract and universal judgments. It thinks in terms of possibilities and potential, of unfolding and not of limitation, sanction and punishment. It holds the importance of our particular embodied and felt connections, the emotional side of our caring for and our caring about, together with both the practical aspects of caring and the acknowledgement of a shared responsibility of all for all, saving all beings in Zen terms. This ethical awareness comes to be an aspect of what the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein called our form of life. The sense in which how we organise the world, how we communicate and share cultural values can be seen as a whole. Something of the same sense in which the French term arrière-plan, their background, is also used in philosophy. Rather than being a series of discrete and isolated, or even theoretically coherent, judgments or beliefs, our form of life expresses our moral or ethical stance as a whole. And so, rather than being made up of abstract ideas of how we believe we or others should live, is both formed and forms by the individual events and experience of how we live our actual lives. Hence, much of the caring we do is routine. Discipline, in one sense, is just letting our behaviours come to be governed by habits we've chosen to follow. And developing a life practice or a Zen practice is the same. So it is with all we take care in: making the bed, sharing household tasks, each and every one of the specifics of our individual lives. All of these share a mixture of predictability and infinite minor variation and run throughout our lives. Then there are the more immediate situations we find ourselves in that need an active response. A child's accident or a parent's health scare. Sometimes action is required. Sometimes just stopping our instinctive reaction to act or to say something unwise. And sometimes it's just being with them and sharing the impossibility of doing anything at all. As Zen students, we can recognise that this needs both insight into the nature of non-separation and our growing applied understanding of non-separation that experience brings us, and to which our working with the precepts hopefully also contributes. How to care in just this situation? But to return to the question we asked above, beyond the routine and the immediate, how can we understand what not separate means for us as a community, a society, a world? Violence or democracy? If violence, by which I mean everything from genocide, warfare and torture, to the legitimate killing, constraint or coercion exercised by the state, and right down to the petty cruelties we are each the daily perpetrators and victims of. If all this violence is the inverse of caring relationship, then the path away from violence is one of meaningful mutual recognition. I am only because you are, and reciprocally so. For this recognition to be more than a hollow sham brings with it an obligation on each side of appropriate care. As a minimum, actively to listen to the other and to respond from a position of openness and possibility. We're familiar with this idea from our earlier work with the precepts and with awareness of our experience within our own immediate circle and personal encounters. Extended to a wider level, we might simply call this democracy. Democracy has no real formal definition or any single shape, and at its simplest is the aspiration that the people, rather than sectional interests, should decide on all important matters collectively and as equals. But this aspiration requires a definitive renunciation of all violent means, and an unwavering commitment to dialogue and to work towards the non-violent resolution of conflict. If in practice our current forms of democracy limit this through their organisation as crudely, you might call them misrepresentative, and hence in restricting what, how and in what terms issues can be examined, then nevertheless dialogue based on recognition, genuinely listening and responding, remains our chief form of resisting violence, and so it is our fostering of more genuinely democratic decision-making at every level, business, community, local, national and international, that is perhaps our single most important means of bringing about a less violent and more genuinely caring society. How to make the voices of all be heard and listened to in immediate and responsive ways. It is in the denial of an effective voice to women, to the poor, to other ethnic or religious groups, to the cognitively different, to those with disabilities, to all those who find themselves othered by those who frame and control our public speech, that violence and domination are maintained and reproduced both within and between our societies, and so too within ourselves. Democracy resists domination through the absolute renunciation of the use of violent means to achieve our ends, and a commitment to dialogue in problem solving and settling disagreement and dispute. Caring relationship rather than coercive violence. In Buddhist terms, this places right speech at the very centre of our lives, and the first three precepts we studied together, honesty, openness and possibility, meeting on equal ground, explored the complexities of what this might mean in practice within our own immediate relationships, including, as always, relationship within ourselves. How to become aware of the coercion and violence within our own speech and in that of others in a way that recognises our non-separation rather than entrenching existing barriers and erecting new ones. How not to win the argument but achieve some level of mutual understanding that strengthens caring relationship. This is right speech in Buddhist terms. It's also caring speech, caring in action, the action of Avalokiteshvara, of Canon Bosatsu, whose first action is to listen to hear the cries of the world. It's no accident that it's Avalokiteshvara, Canon, who speaks the great speech of non-separation, that is, the Heart Sutra. Prajna, understanding or wisdom, emerges from the practical recognition of non-separation, that is relationship, that is care. It is the embodiment of non-violence and an active resistance to domination and coercion, whether that of the state, of others, or that we find within ourselves. Real democracy is nothing other than the practice of this care at a collective level. As Zenists, we cannot pretend that our practice can ever be an exclusively individual affair, or that decisions that affect the collective body should be left to the powers that be, our betters, or the divine emperor. The experience and practice of Zen offer us insight to address both individual and collective suffering as suffering beings who are impermanent and hence vulnerable, caring and cared for like any others. Caring for the three treasures. Care is part of all aspects of our lives and hence too of our Zen practice. Care is there with our experience of daily zazen and our sitting together in a sangha. Care is in the returning to my cushion and in sitting still without fidgeting or moving, at least insofar as I'm able. Care is doing that not just this time, but every time, and every time in my returning to the cushion and my committing to return. Care is brushing the mat clean when I stand up or sit down. Care is arranging the cushion to give me good sport. Care is lighting the candle and offering incense with mindfulness and respect, but without exaggeration. Care is so many of the aspects of my practice that make it a discipline that I share with others, and one that is far more than a set of techniques or a hobby, and also something other than a belief. This is the beginning of a caring that holds both self and others, and outside the Zendo, it's just the same. I bear witness in bringing my awareness to the life of the world of which I am a part, and where there is suffering, I respond out of that awareness, out of what that awareness calls forth in me. I can, and should, also offer appropriate appreciation for the value and multiplicity of the caring work that I do, and of that I receive. The tendency of our economically driven society is to act as if there are carers on one side and the cared for on the other, who, by their status, wealth or social custom, gets a care pass out of getting their hands dirty, and whose caring is instead taken for granted. Always remembering that in reality I am always both carer and cared for in a constantly shifting modality. My caring for begins in all the micro-care we offer each other every day, a smile shared with a passerby on the street, an exchange of kind words with a work colleague, extending to what might be the profession that is my life's work, or else be the only job I could find that will pay the rent. It might be the care I offer and receive, in all its complexity of good and ill will, love and obligation, to and from my children, my parents, friends, community. If I'm in a relationship, it will most definitely involve exploring the giving and withholding on both sides that I experience and the thoughts and feelings around this. I offer to myself an appreciation of the value of the care I give and receive. And all this work is an aspect of self-care, remembering that caring for all beings has always had to include my caring for this being that I am. Moving beyond this, I can examine deeply and continuously what brings me to become uncaring, to be careless. On the one hand, my sense of lack, of insufficiency, of isolation and separation. On the other hand, my sense of uniqueness, entitlement, self-sufficiency and individual autonomy. And how are those apparent opposites actually connected? Who provides my care? What's the basis of these relationships? Familial? Financial? Once we begin to examine these connections, the net spreads wider and wider, spanning the assumed divide between my most intimate feelings and the economics and politics of our shared world. Who decides what caring I do and what care I receive and on what basis? What are the reasons I feel it's not my job to do some kinds of caring work? Because I'm male or well off? Because I'm educated or smart? Because the government should do it? Because people should be self-reliant? Because they don't deserve it? Again, switch this round. What forms of being cared for are restricted or denied to me? And in what ways might my needs, physical, emotional, spiritual and other, be better met? What would need to change? And noticing, questioning again and again if any of this leads back in the direction of self-judgment and the self-justification or self-hatred that swiftly follows. Just noticing, just being aware of why I live this life in the way I do, in this society. Very much of the violence and inequality that surrounds us is directly dependent on the illusion of separation and our individual and collective actions that results from this. Can I come better to see and understand that I'm truly one people with all those marginalised, excluded and othered? That it's not enough simply to offer them membership of what I feel to be my society on my terms. I can examine in what ways my inclusion of some is always based on the exclusion of others. I'll reiterate that this has to be done without judgment of myself, because to do so would simply return me to the self-centred dream which benefits nobody. Without judgment, but noting one's own response of defensiveness and any other emotions that arise, and so bearing witness to myself as I am, not as I fantasize or would wish myself to be. Some might imagine this to be an unhappy task, but I've found this process to be profoundly liberating and to give rise to surprise, to a sense of spaciousness and of relative freedom, and finally to deep joy. Not to imagine that I am, or ever will be in any sense, pure or good or wise, but simply that the straitjacket of separation loosens, that I can breathe a little better, and that I can incrementally, more freely experience myself as this world. I find that the basis of being one people is always the recognition of our shared vulnerability and also of our perpetual attempts to deny this vulnerability. In this way, I can learn to care with others. My caring about manifests as taking care of the people and things that matter to me. Our living in accordance with life as it is inevitably a life of care, of caring for and caring about, and of being cared for and being cared about. Bringing awareness to my sensations, to my feelings, to my thoughts, I can come to see the ways I act as if I were an entirely separate, self-consistent and permanent being, and the harm and suffering that flow from this. I can come to see the way this self that I am, the way it's produced, conjured out of a world that is already social and embodied, can come to see how the way my vision, emotions and understanding are framed, how all this gives rise to the illusion that I see clearly a world that is out there, when the reality is that there is only continuum and process. I can come to see that ideas like freedom and responsibility are both more nuanced and more problematic than I thought them to be, because neither freedom nor responsibility is ever simply to do with me, but are co-produced by all of us, and all too often in ways that consolidate inequality and mutual harming. And so, I may come to see and experience life as it is differently, and act in accordance with this different experiencing. As ought and should fall away, I may come to see the precepts not as a prescription for awakened action, but instead as a description of it. Being just this moment becomes more to experience myself as fluid connection with all other beings rather than as a self that is defended and isolated. In this sense, being just this moment is caring, and caring is action. Acting in accordance with non-separation, interdependency and impermanence, we come to meet and create less resistance and experience that resistance differently. This is what Dogen spoke of in relation to Zazen as the Dharma gate of joy and ease. We are open to ourselves, to each other, and to the world, to relationship in all its senses. I can simply respond with appropriate action. Respond within the awareness of my own calculation, exaltation, judgment and blame. I can be open to the experience of how in being just this moment there is, as the Wisdom Sutras say, no carer, no cared for, no caring. It's in acting as if we are finally separate that we come to defame the three treasures, to be a self that is always already, to be a self with others. I am a separate individual only by abstraction, but first of all I am the dynamic play of forces that is life as it is, in this place at this time. I do not exist against the world, but as the world. We must clearly honour Buddha, Dharma and Sangha in this recognition that our continuing active engagement with the Zen precepts invites us to, in our bearing witness and our aspiration, in our upholding the Zen precepts as living practice. Roughly 1500 years ago, Shantideva wrote of this nothing else to do in the Bodhicharyavatara, the guide to the Bodhisattva path. May I be the medicine and the physician for the sick. May I be an inexhaustible treasury for the destitute. May I become food and drink in times of famine. May I be a protector for those who have no protection, a guide for travellers and a boat, a bridge and a ship for those who wish to cross over. May I be a lamp for those who seek light. This may sound like the work of saints, but it is exactly what we each and together do and don't do every day of our lives. The Bodhisattva precepts are a constant reminder that as our practice grounds itself in the non-ground of emptiness, of not separate, then to be an I is always already to be a we. This is the good of which the ceremony of Jukai speaks. This good is not the opposite of bad. This good can be called self-nature, Buddha nature, no nature, the absolute. So, how shall we care with, care for, and be cared for? How